Welcome to Bifocal. This is the start of a new series in our business segment. And this series is going to be on how I started my business. We're going to talk to several different entrepreneurs and kind of get their story of how they started their business. And I thought the way to start this off would be I would be telling my story on how I started Concept. Stay tuned. Welcome to Bifocal. This is a brand new series, and this series is how I started my business. And we're going to talk to a lot of different entrepreneurs, and I'm going to kick this off with my own story on how I started Concept Services. Concept Services, you can visit us at www.conceptltd.com. I actually started Concept Services. It's called Concept now, but back then it was Concept Services. I actually started it in 2002, but there was quite a story prior to that. And before I get into the actual story of how I started it, maybe I'll give you just a brief history of Concept for those of you who are not familiar with Concept. Concept is a lead generation company. We work with companies all across the country in helping them generate sales leads. And whether we do that via cold calling, whether we do it via social media, email marketing, pay-per-click, Google ads, that type of thing, whatever the solution is that best fits their needs, that's what Concept does. So that's the business I'm going to be describing. And before I get into that, let me kind of give you a little history of how I even came about that company. I had been in sales pretty much my whole career, and I loved sales. And the part of the sales process that I didn't really enjoy was the cold calling. And it's kind of ironic that's the business that I formed, but it wasn't the most fun part of the sales process. The part that I really enjoyed was getting out and meet with customers. That was the most fun. I loved getting out, talking to them, going through that discovery process, finding out what their needs were, why did they have that need, what had they done in the past? What were they thinking now as far as their solution moving forward? And listening to that and then trying to determine how do I fit that into the product or service that I have to offer? And that was very, very interesting to me. But the thought of ending that meeting and coming back to the office and having to get on the phone and start cold calling, that was not as appealing to me. And as I began to kind of progress into my sales career and got a little bit more mature professionally and in sales, I began realizing that I wasn't alone with that feeling. And there were probably a lot of sales reps out there that they were like me. They loved being in front of the customer, not real crazy about making the cold calls. And so as I progressed through my career, I made the calls. You did it every day. That's what you did. But it wasn't my most fun thing to do. And then I began to realize that if I felt that way, there were a lot of other reps that felt that way. And if that were the case, then from a company standpoint, the companies were pretty inefficient. Because what that meant was, for me personally, I felt I was good. I enjoyed being out in front of the customer. But I wasn't as good being on the phone, and I didn't enjoy it. And if that was the case, natural human tendencies, you kind of migrate to what you like. And if there were a lot of people like me, which I was confident there were a lot of sales reps out there that they weren't good at that front end part of the sales process. And if they weren't good there, that was hurting that was hurting the company that they work for. It was inefficient. And because that in sales, as you all know, there's many aspects of it, but that front end, that getting the lead, getting the appointment, getting the opportunity in front of the customer, that's pretty big. And for me, that wasn't my strongest suit. I loved being in front of the customer where I could sit across from them. I could look at their body language. I could read their eyes. I could see their expression. If I said something and I saw them nodding their head, that gave me confidence that we were on the same page. I kind of felt like I had a full toolbox. But when I picked up that phone to make that phone call, I didn't know if that person on the other end was sitting back and saying, come on, buddy. He's thinking, come on, buddy. He's rolling his eyes, get to the point. I don't have time for this. I don't know if he was putting his phone on mute, talking to somebody else. I didn't know anything. And so I felt like my tool set was ripped away. And I just wasn't, in fact, at times I was intimidated making the call. It just wasn't my strong suit. And so as I began to realize that, I began to think, there's a business out there. If that's the case for me, that's the case for a lot of sales reps. That's the case for a lot of companies. And if that's the case, there's a business out there. And so that's what Concept does. That's ultimately the business that I started. So before I tell you exactly how I got started, I'm going to walk you back a little bit because I didn't immediately fall into that business. That wasn't the service that I initially started out. Concept was formed in February of 2002. However, my story starts 2 years earlier, back in 2000. I was part owner of another company, a technology company, a Microsoft training center. And I decided to leave that company and I was going to start my own business. Not the business that I just described. I was going to start something different. I was going to start a sales business where I was going to be the salesperson and I was going to align myself with 3, maybe 4 different companies. If you're familiar with the old manufacturer's rep type thing where you had a salesperson, independent sales rep, and he represented multiple product lines. That's kind of what I was going to do. And I was going to align myself with, as I mentioned, maybe 3 different companies. And all the companies that I was going to align with were companies in the technology arena. That was my background. I had sold in technology. And so what I was going to do is I was going to align myself with companies that sold synergistic services, but not competitive services. So for example, I might try to find a customer who sold web development services. I may try to find another company that sells training services. And maybe a third company that sells network consulting services. So they're kind of all in this technology type space, but they don't compete with one another. I felt that this business that I was going to start, I felt that its benefit was that I may not be able to get in the door with one of these services. But if I got in the door with a different one, I could always represent and find opportunities for the other one. So that was going to kind of be my pitch, if you will. So I was going to get out, talk with companies, pitch this to them. Mr. Customer, here's the benefit. Here's the benefit of you going with my company. You're going to get a seasoned sales rep. And I was seasoned at the time. I was 40 years old at that time, 39, 40 years old. Mr. Customer, you're going to get a seasoned sales rep for a fraction of the cost of you going to hire somebody. You will pay me a very small nominal rate. My goal was I was going to charge each of these customers, let's assume I had 3, I was going to charge each of these customers, I didn't even know at the time, to be honest with you, I was going to charge them, we'll say, $10 an hour. Now, they may be paying quite a bit more than that for a seasoned sales rep. But let's assume I'm going to charge them 10. But if I charge customer 1 10, customer 2 10, customer 3 10, it's a good deal for them because it's much cheaper than what they would pay. I would make $30 an hour collectively, so it was a good deal for me. And then I would have individual commission plans, if you will, for each one of them. And the benefit to the customer, once again, was, Mr. Customer, you're going to get a seasoned sales rep for a fraction of the cost. You're not going to have to pay me benefits. You're not going to have to give me a PC. You're not going to have to pay me mileage. You're not going to have to give me retirement, give me a place to work, give me a PC. None of that. You're going to pay this small nominal rate, and we'll negotiate a commission plan if I sell. And Mr. Customer, although it may be difficult to get in the door with networking services, I represent a couple other lines that sometimes it's easier to get in the door. And once I'm in the door, I can look for opportunity for your service. That was the pitch. So what I did is I left the company I was working with, and I was part owner of that company, so it was a big move. And I decided I was going to go out. So what I did is I went out, set up shop down my basement, and I just went out and started talking to a bunch of people I knew. Started sharing this idea because I wanted to get some feedback to what did people think. Was this a good idea, a bad idea? And most everybody that I talked to shared that they thought it was a good idea. So I'm thinking, man, I'm on to something. Then it dawned on me that everybody that I was talking to knew me. So I didn't know whether I would share this story with them and they said, man, that's a great idea. And then you walk away and they go, whoa, man, that was a crazy idea. And they felt sorry for me because I didn't have a job. And so they're just encouraging me. I didn't know. Everybody knew me, so I didn't know whether they were just being nice to me, encouraging me. So I remember one night sat down with Val, my wife, and I said, I'm getting a lot of good feedback, but it's really from everybody that I know. And I really need to talk to some people that I don't know. And although at the time I had one company that was ready to work with me, they were ready to get engaged. It was a company I knew, but nonetheless, they were ready to go. So I had that going. They were ready for me to put a contract together and a proposal, which I didn't have any of that put together at the time. And so what I did is this is back in 2000. So what I did is I went into the Yellow Pages. That's back when the Yellow Pages was a viable book to use. Went into the Yellow Pages in Akron, Cleveland, and I just pulled out at random 13 companies in the technology space. And I drafted a letter on just plain white paper. I didn't have any station. I'd only started this business 2 weeks ago or so. And so I drafted a letter on plain white stationery and couple paragraphs explained who I was, what I was doing, what my business was. And I addressed it attention president. And so I stuffed these envelopes. There was plain white stationery and a plain white envelope, no business card, and sent it out to 13 people in Akron and Cleveland. And I think I sent that out probably on a Monday. And said to my wife, I said, well, I sent that out blind to 13 people. Let's see if anybody responds. Sure enough, 2 nights later, 8 o'clock at night, my phone rings. I pick it up, and sure enough, it's the president of a company who received my letter. He introduced himself to me. His name was Larry. He introduced himself, said he found it interesting, wanted to know if we could get together. And I said, yeah, I'd love to get together. So we arranged to get together, I think it was like 2 days later, we arranged to meet for lunch at Fridays. So a couple days go by, I'm working on this proposal, this contract from this company that's ready to engage me, and I'm thinking, hey, I got a job, or I got a contract, I got another company who's interested, and I'm thinking maybe something's going here. And so I'm working on some things, waiting for see if anyone else follows up on the 13 letters, because that was a big mailing campaign, and that was for me, that was big. I thought that was a brainstorm. But anyways, nobody else was responding, and about 2 days later, I meet with Larry for lunch. We met up at Fridays. Shared with him who I was, what my background was. Interesting, Larry's business was a software consulting company. They did software development, custom software development. So companies who had a need for a custom application and they couldn't find that application on the market, they would contract a company like Larry's and they would develop it. Well, ironically, I had worked in that space for about 4 years previously. So I knew Larry's business like the back of my hand. I had performed various jobs inside that business. I worked in sales inside that business. So Larry and I hit it off very well. So we had a great lunch meeting. We left the lunch meeting with Larry saying, hey, let me think about it. You know, Larry mentioned to me that he had a sales rep. He said, hey, I already have a sales rep. Does that matter to you? And I said, no, it doesn't matter to me. You can point that sales rep one direction and point me another, and if that works out for you, I'm perfectly fine with it. So we left that meeting, and Larry said, hey, give me a couple days to think about it, and I'll follow up with you. When I left that meeting with Larry, I was pretty set that I was going to definitely move forward in starting this business. And the reason was I had already had one company that was ready to work with me. It was just a matter of getting the proposal and the contract signed. And I had Larry, who, whether he worked with me or not, was really kind of irrelevant to me at the time, because I knew he was genuinely interested. And I could tell that he saw interest. So as much as I wanted him to work with me, it was irrelevant because I knew he saw value. And so about 2 days later, sure enough, Larry gives me a call. And he calls me, and I pick the phone up, and he said, hey, Dan, this is Larry. He said, could we get back together? And I said, sure. What would you like to talk about? And he said, I'd like to, I've been given thought, and I'd like to offer you a job. And I said to Larry, I said, well, hey, I really appreciate that, but right now I'm not interested in getting a job. I'm really interested in moving forward with this business plan. And that's kind of what I want to do, and that's what I've set out to do. And I'm just at a point right now where it seems to make sense for me to do that. And Larry said, well, will you at least come in and talk and hear what I have to say? And I said, well, Larry, I appreciate it, but I don't want to mislead you, and I'm really not interested, so I really think it would be a waste of your time. And he said, well, why don't you come in and let's just talk? And I said, Larry, I appreciate it, but it just would be a waste of time. That's not the direction I'm going to go. Finally, Larry said, will you just come in and listen to me? So I said, okay, I'll come in, but I want you to know up front, it's not the direction I'm going to go, and I don't want to mislead you. And he said, fine. So we set up to meet the very next day. And I was flattered, I was interested in what he had to say, but it just wasn't the direction that I was going to go. So the tables turned drastically that evening. And it was about 5 o'clock that day that Larry called me. And well, it was early in the afternoon, but it was 5 o'clock had come around, and I was downstairs working, and my wife yells down, "Dan, it's time for dinner." So I remember shutting the PC down and walking to the bottom of the steps. And when I got to the bottom of the steps, and I remember looking up the top of the steps, and there was my son. I had 3 children at that time. My oldest son, Jeff, was about 12. I had a daughter, Jen, who was 10, and my youngest son, Josh, was 8. And I remember when I got to the bottom of the steps, and I looked up the top of the steps, Jeff was at the top of the steps looking down at me and just looking me straight in the eye. And like he had never done before. And I knew something was different, something was on his mind. And I remember as I walked up the steps, he just continued to stare at me. And he stayed at the top of the steps. And I finally got to the top step and stepped up into the kitchen area. And right at the top of the steps, we had a bathroom. And I remember I walked into the bathroom to wash my hands. And Jeff stood at the bathroom door and still just staring me in the eye. He didn't say anything, and it was one of these where I'm washing my hands and kind of, looking at him, and he's not saying anything. We went into the kitchen. We sat down at the table. I sat on one end. Jeff sat at the other end. We sat down. Out of the blue, Jeff says, "Dad, I don't like when you work at home." Totally floored me. Wasn't expecting that. And keep in mind, I had only been working at home for probably 30 days. Just trying to make something happen. Didn't have any business yet. And out of the blue, this is before we even started dinner, he says, "Dad, I don't like when you work at home." And I remember saying, "Why?" And he said, "Well, ever since you worked at home, you started working at home," he said, "you're serious all the time." He said, "You used to come home from work," and he said, "we used to joke around and play, and we'd throw the ball," and he said, "now you're just serious all the time." Well, that just totally, it freaked me out. It scared me, caught me way off guard. And my wife and I remember we just kind of looked at one another, and we finished dinner, and the kids went on their way. And I remember Val and I, after dinner, went in and sat in the living room, and I said, "Hey, I don't think I can do this. I don't think I can go into business." I said, "if the kids are sensing this stuff now," I said, "this is going to be tough." I said, "we're going to go through some financial stuff, and it's going to be stress. And if they're sensing this now, I'm not sure I want to put them through that." I said, I don't think I'm going to move forward." And she said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm probably going to look for a job." I said, "Tomorrow I meet with Larry. He wants to meet with me." I said, "I think he wants to offer me a job. I'm going to go in and listen to see what he has to say." So the next morning I wake up, I go in, talk to Larry. Larry, he thinks that I'm dead set, that I'm moving forward with starting my business. He doesn't know that I had a bomb dropped on me the night before, and that I'm doing a 180, and that I'm not going to start a business, and that I'm all eyes and ears to listen to what he has to say. So we sit down and we talked, and I'll tell you, if I were looking for a job, which I was at that time, but Larry's company was a hand and glove fit. It couldn't have been any more of a fit for me. And as I mentioned earlier, I had done his business for 4 or 5 years, and I knew it. And I think that's what was of interest to Larry. He knew that. He knew I knew his business. He knew I was experienced in his business. And it couldn't have been a better fit if I were looking for this job. that would have been the type of company I would have looked for. So he and I sat down in a conference room. I remember there was a big round table, and we sat down in it, and Larry just started sharing about his business and how he got started and what he's hoping to do and where he's at, and a little bit about himself and why he was interested in hiring me. And I continued with him a little bit, implying that I was still going to start this business. And I guess if I'm totally honest, I felt I had maybe a little bit of some leverage card there because he wanted me. And I thought, well, hey, business is business. Let me see what I can leverage here if I'm just being totally honest and candid. And so I, shared once again with Larry that, hey, I'm not really interested, Larry. This is really what I'm going to do is I'm going to start this business. And Larry once again proceeded down with why he was interested, and we talked, and eventually it got into money and benefits, and so finally at one point, Larry shared some things, and I shared some things back, and then finally I said, well, Larry, here's where I'm at. For me to accept a job with you, this is what I'm looking for. And it wasn't all money. Money was a big part of it, but it was more. It was things about what I wanted for my role, big picture, environment, just things that were important. I was 40 years old at that time. And so I had been in the job market now for 20 years. I knew what I was looking for. So I remember sharing with Larry. I said, Larry, here's the situation. If I were to accept a job with you, this is what I'm looking for. And I spelled it out. And Larry said, okay. And I thought, okay, what do I do now? And so we talked. I accepted a job with Larry that day and went home. Told the kids I'm not starting a business. Told my wife I just got a job. Our life's just turned 180 from where I thought I was going. And I never started the business. And that was in 2000. At that time, I was excited to start with Larry. But at the same time, I was pretty disappointed that I didn't get this opportunity to start my business. I felt I was just at a good time. It was a good time for a lot of reasons for me to start this business. And I thought now that if I don't do it now, I'm never going to do this again. And so that wasn't a great feeling. It was kind of a little bit of an empty feeling, but at the same time, things just weren't right. Jeff shared that with me. He was right. It hit me like a ton of bricks, and I knew it was right, but at the same time, it was a little bit disheartening that I wasn't going to get to start this business. And so at that time, although it was kind of this bittersweet, I was fortunate that I got a job quick. At the same time, I was going to miss this opportunity. What I didn't know was this job I took with Larry was really the first step in a big step, probably the biggest step of all, of what ended up catapulting me to start Concept. And I would have never guessed it at the time, but that door that was open, this door was closed, was starting a business. This door with Larry was open. I never knew or would have even imagined what I was walking into when I walked in with Larry. And that just started the whole sequence of events which all led into me starting Concept Services in 2002. I'm going to end it right here for part one. This is going to be a multiple part series on how I started Concept Services. And I think you're going to want to join in to the next episode, because I'm going to get into talking about what all transpired after I started with Larry, and it's quite a journey. And so I hope you come back, tune into the next episode, and we'll keep this story going. Hey, thanks for tuning in.